A racist and corrupt cop tried to choke a young black girl right in front of her father, but what he didn't know, what not a single fiber of his arrogance prepared him for, was that the man he just crossed wasn't just her dad. He was a legendary U.S. Navy SEAL. And what happened next, in mere seconds, shattered everything the officer thought he controlled, flipping the entire story upside down. It started on a quiet suburban street, one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where the lawns are perfect and the sidewalks barely see any trouble. A peaceful morning turned into a nightmare the moment a cop slammed the brakes of his cruiser and stepped out with aggression in his eyes and hate in his tone. He wasn't responding to a robbery or a call for help. He wasn't defusing a threat. He saw a young black girl unlocking her own bike in front of her middle school and, just like that, assumed she was stealing. No hesitation. No investigation. Just bias, boiling straight into brutality. "Hey! Step away from that bike," he barked across the sidewalk, voice sharp enough to cut through glass. The girl froze. "Excuse me," she said softly, confused, one hand still gripping the handlebars. "I said step back. That's not yours." He was already walking toward her, hand hovering close to his holster, chest puffed up like he was charging into war. She held up her phone, showing the digital unlock screen from the bike app. "I just scanned it. This is my account." "My dad," but that was enough. "Don't talk back to me, girl." His hand gripped her wrist, yanking her away so hard she stumbled. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder. The bike clattered to the ground. She looked around, desperate. Parents. Students. No one moved. Phones started coming out, recording in silence, but no one said a word. The fear was paralyzing. And then came the scream, not hers. A man's voice, filled with fury, shaking with disbelief. "Get your damn hands off my daughter." The crowd parted. A tall, quiet man rushed forward. Calm. Sharp. Unafraid. But the cop didn't flinch. Not 1 inch. He yanked the girl upright, twisted her arm, and with a grin laced with hate, growled, "Maybe a few seconds off the ground will teach her how to follow orders." Right there, in daylight, in front of a dozen witnesses, he wrapped his forearm around her neck. The father didn't move at first. His eyes didn't blink. He saw everything, the cruelty, the humiliation, the casual way the officer tried to strip the humanity from his daughter, to degrade her in front of her peers, in front of him, like they were less than people. He stood still, letting the fire build, measuring the moment. Because while that cop thought he was dominating a frightened teenage girl and her panicked father, what he had unknowingly done was awaken a part of history that should never be provoked. This wasn't just a dad. This was a man who had served his country with his hands, his mind, and his silence. A ghost in black ops missions. A war-tested soldier trained to eliminate threats before they even knew they were in danger. He didn't need guns. He didn't need to shout. His mere presence should have been a warning. But the cop didn't recognize it. Or maybe he just didn't want to. Maybe racism had blinded him so deeply that he couldn't see the storm rising right in front of him. And so, in that moment, with his daughter gasping and the crowd watching in frozen horror, the man acted. But he didn't act out of rage. He acted with precision. With training. With purpose. What happened next was not chaos. It was calculation. In seconds, the officer found himself no longer in control, his arms no longer obeying, his breath shortened, his authority dismantled without a single punch thrown. He was on the ground. Unharmed, but immobilized. Disarmed. Stripped of power, in every sense. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because the moment he touched that girl, the moment he humiliated her, he didn't just pick a fight with a father. He exposed a cancer growing inside the department, one that had festered under the watch of a police chief who'd spent years protecting officers just like him. Men who abused power and wore their badge like a weapon, not a shield. Men who thought a neighborhood like this was theirs to control, their law to write, their justice to bend. And the man they underestimated? He knew more than how to fight back. He knew how to expose them. In the hours that followed, calls were made. Files were pulled. Contacts activated. Voices awakened. A chain of truth began to unravel, one link at a time, reaching higher than any of them had expected. The corruption wasn't isolated. It was protected. Shielded by policy, by silence, by people in power who'd rather protect their own than protect the public. This story is not about violence. It's about vengeance served cold, with the blade of truth. It's about a father who refused to let his daughter's spirit be crushed in front of him. It's about what happens when the system thinks it can get away with anything, and someone finally says, enough. And yet, the question that still remains, the one no one expected, isn't just how did the father take them down. It's who he really is. Because what this officer didn't know, what the chief failed to consider, and what the entire city would soon discover, is that this man wasn't finished yet. So the question is, when you finally find out who he was, and what he was capable of doing behind the scenes, will you still believe that justice is blind? Or will you finally see what it looks like, when justice has a name? Are you ready to find out what happened next? Before we begin, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand with you. We do not tolerate racism in any form, not in our stories, not in our community, not in our world. This channel is a safe space for truth, justice, and powerful voices to be heard. Now, sit back and get ready for a story that will shake you, inspire you, and remind you that justice has many faces. If you believe in stories that matter, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Enjoy the story. The morning sun painted the sidewalks of Charlotte, North Carolina in soft gold, the kind of quiet suburban glow that made everything seem peaceful, almost safe. On these streets, birds chirped in the distance, car engines hummed gently to life, and families carried on with their routines like they had for years. The smell of freshly cut grass, the rhythmic sound of sprinklers clicking to life, and the distant laughter of schoolchildren set the scene for what should have been just another normal day. But normal is a fragile illusion, especially when the cracks of prejudice run deep beneath the surface of calm. And for one family, that illusion was about to shatter. Marcus Johnson had lived in this neighborhood for almost 3 years. He wasn't flashy, didn't talk much, and barely ever raised his voice. A tall, imposing man in his mid-40s with a carved jawline and a calm intensity in his eyes, Marcus carried the kind of presence that didn't need to be loud to be respected. Most of the neighbors knew little about him other than the basics: single father, quiet, polite, former military. He didn't go to block parties or wave over fences. He kept to himself, always moving with purpose, like a man who had seen more than he let on. He drove a black pickup, always spotless, always parked perfectly straight. His lawn was always trimmed, his bills always paid, and his daughter always walked to school on time, rain or shine. There was nothing that screamed trouble about Marcus. And yet, trouble seemed to find its way to him, not because of who he was, but because of what the world insisted on seeing. His daughter, Aaliyah, was 14. Sharp, observant, and already far more mature than most kids her age. She was the kind of girl who asked deep questions at the dinner table, read 2 books at the same time, and volunteered to help her classmates with math homework, even the ones who ignored her in the cafeteria. With big curls always pulled into a neat puff and a backpack full of books and snacks she never ate, Aaliyah was the definition of potential. She had dreams, big ones. Law school, civil rights work, maybe even politics one day. But her world wasn't just school and homework. She had been taught to recognize danger, not just the obvious kind, but the kind that hides behind badges, behind smiles, behind laws written by people who never had to live like her. Marcus had raised her alone since her mother passed when Aaliyah was just a toddler. He never remarried, never even dated seriously. His focus was razor sharp: protect her, prepare her, and make sure she never had to fight the same battles he did. He had served in the Navy for over a decade, but not just in uniform. Marcus was part of an elite unit within the SEALs, a ghost in conflicts the public never heard about. His work was buried under layers of classified missions, operations that saved lives without ever making headlines. He had walked through war zones with nerves of steel and made life-or-death decisions in seconds. But the hardest mission of his life was learning how to be a father in a country that saw his daughter as a threat before it saw her as a child. He never told Aaliyah much about his past. Just enough for her to understand that he had seen things, dark things, and that his silence wasn't distance, it was discipline. Every morning, he packed her lunch, checked her homework, and walked her halfway to school before letting her ride the last few blocks on her bike. It was part of their routine. She said it made her feel grown up. He said it made him feel useful. Somewhere between her independence and his protection, they found a rhythm. But rhythm can be broken. The school was in a predominantly white district, a well-funded institution filled with the children of lawyers, doctors, and real estate developers. Aaliyah had earned a place there through a magnet program focused on academic excellence. She was one of only 6 black students in the entire 8th grade. And though she excelled in class, won essay contests, and even earned a student leadership award, she was often met with suspicion. Some teachers praised her intelligence but questioned her attitude. Some students befriended her in private but ignored her in public. And some parents looked at Marcus at PTA meetings as though he didn't belong, as if raising a daughter alone in their pristine neighborhood was a disruption of the order they silently agreed to maintain. But Marcus was used to being out of place. He didn't seek their approval. He didn't need it. What he needed was to keep Aaliyah safe. And on most days, that felt possible. Until Officer Bradley Tate entered their lives. Tate had been on the local police force for just over 6 years. White, mid-30s, stocky build, with a face that smiled easily but eyes that didn't. He was known for being tough on crime, a phrase that often translated to harsh on anyone who didn't look like him. He had a history of complaints, excessive force, verbal abuse, racial profiling, all quietly buried under layers of bureaucracy and protection from his longtime mentor, Chief Darryl Monroe. Monroe had run the department for nearly 2 decades. Charismatic in front of cameras but ruthless behind closed doors, Monroe built a culture of silence, rewarding loyalty over accountability. Together, he and Tate had created a pattern, a game of unchecked power, veiled in the language of community safety. What neither of them expected was Marcus. Because Marcus didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't threaten lawsuits. He watched. He listened. He remembered. And when things didn't feel right, he didn't react emotionally. He documented. He researched. He prepared. The tension began subtly. A ticket here. A slow patrol car crawling past their home more than once a day. Aaliyah getting stopped on her way to school because her backpack matched a description. Nothing big enough to make the news. Just enough to make them feel watched. Judged. Cornered. But Marcus remained calm. He taught Aaliyah to stay calm too. Don't give them what they want, he'd say, give them nothing. And she did. Until the morning everything exploded. Aaliyah had earned enough allowance to rent an electric bike for the week. It was her little reward for acing her science project, a simple luxury that made her feel like part of the other kids. She'd used her phone to unlock it through a city-sponsored app, just like she had done twice before. That morning, she was dressed in her school colors, had her ID around her neck, and was early, as usual. She leaned down to check the tire pressure when she heard the car pull up behind her. She didn't turn right away. She thought maybe someone needed directions. She didn't even flinch when the door slammed shut. She only froze when she heard the voice. Hey! Step away from that bike. The words hit like a slap. Her heart skipped. She turned slowly, trying to stay composed. I just unlocked it, she said, voice steady. She lifted her phone. It's my account. But it didn't matter. Not to Tate. He saw what he wanted to see. And what he wanted was a suspect, not a student. Within seconds, he was beside her. Demanding answers. Dismissing her proof. Telling her to put her hands up. Accusing her of theft. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. She told him her father was nearby. That this was a misunderstanding. She begged him to check the app, to look at her name, her ID. But he didn't listen. He grabbed her arm, twisted her around, and pushed her toward the curb. That's when Marcus turned the corner. The moment their eyes met, Aaliyah's face crumpled. Not from fear, but from shame. Because in front of her father, in front of strangers, she was being treated like a criminal for simply existing. Marcus didn't scream. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, carefully, but each step carried the weight of decades, of war, of loss, of quiet rage stored in his bones. He spoke once, clearly, "Let go of my daughter." But Tate wasn't listening. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he thought the silence was weakness. It wasn't. And what happened in the next few seconds would change everything, for Marcus, for Aaliyah, for Tate, for Chief Monroe, and for an entire community that had spent far too long ignoring the quiet injustice under their own feet. But before the world could know what Marcus was truly capable of, before the truth could unravel the illusion of control that Monroe built over years, there would be a moment, a single heartbeat of hesitation, when power met precision. And when that moment came, the question wouldn't be who was right. It would be who would survive what came next. The patrol car was still idling at the curb, its lights off, but the energy around it buzzed like a live wire. Aaliyah stood frozen, one arm pinned uncomfortably by Officer Tate's grip, her bike lying on the sidewalk like a piece of evidence. Her breath was shaky but silent. She'd learned not to scream. Not because she wasn't scared, but because she knew it wouldn't help. At that moment, it wasn't about noise. It was about endurance. And just beyond the parked cars, her father was walking closer. Each step deliberate, as if his body already knew the storm he was about to walk into. Marcus approached with measured calm, his face unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't shout. That wasn't his way. He observed the situation with the eyes of someone who had been trained to assess threats under fire. But this was no battlefield in Afghanistan or Iraq. This was the sidewalk outside his daughter's school. And the enemy wasn't hiding behind camouflage. He wore a uniform, a badge, and the confidence of someone who believed there would be no consequences. Marcus stopped just 3 feet away from the officer and said, low and firm, "That's my daughter. You need to release her. Right now." Tate barely glanced at him. His grip didn't loosen. "Step back, sir. This is an investigation," he replied, with a sneer that barely concealed his disdain. "I need to verify that she didn't tamper with this property. It's city-owned. Could be a stolen account. Could be fraud." Aaliyah's voice broke through, a quiet plea. "Please just look at my phone. It's my account. My name's right there." "I didn't do anything," Tate snapped. "You don't get to talk when I'm talking. Understand?" Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice controlled. "You've got 30 seconds to let her go. After that, you'll be dealing with more than just a complaint." Tate turned fully to him, stepping between Marcus and Aaliyah like a wall. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he barked. "You want to get arrested for obstruction? You want to play that game?" Marcus didn't blink. "You're laying hands on a minor with no cause and no evidence. You're escalating a situation that didn't exist 5 minutes ago. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you, you're making a mistake that's going to follow you." Tate smirked and looked toward his car, perhaps thinking of backup, or maybe just letting the tension build for his own amusement. He still hadn't checked the app. Still hadn't looked at Aaliyah's ID. He was too deep in his authority now. Stepping down would mean admitting he was wrong. And people like him didn't step down. Not when they were used to getting away with it. Not when they knew they had someone like Chief Monroe covering their backs. But the dynamic shifted when a woman across the street shouted, "I'm recording this," and raised her phone. A couple others joined in. The air changed. The audience grew. For the first time, Officer Tate hesitated. Not because he feared being caught, he was used to cameras. He just didn't like losing control. And Marcus felt it. He watched that flicker of uncertainty in the man's posture. That split-second pause between arrogance and anxiety. Still, Tate didn't let go. Instead, he tightened his grip and hissed under his breath, "You think you scare me? You people always think you can bark and will back off. That's not how it works. Not here." Marcus stepped closer, his voice now low enough that only the officer could hear him. "You don't know who I am. And you've got no idea what's about to happen to you." That was the moment Aaliyah gasped, a sharp cry that cut through everything. Whether it was the pressure on her wrist or just the fear finally breaking the surface, no one could ignore it anymore. A man in a hoodie moved toward the curb, shouting, "Hey man, that's a kid. What the hell's wrong with you?" Tate looked up sharply and finally, reluctantly, released her. She stumbled back into Marcus's arms, shaking. His hand came up to steady her. He didn't touch Tate. Not yet. Sirens sounded in the distance, though no one had called them. Monroe's style. Always send backup before the paperwork even starts. And just as the second cruiser rolled up, Marcus took a step back, cradling Aaliyah with one arm while pulling his phone from his pocket with the other. No one noticed the discreet tap he made on the side of the screen. No one knew what it activated. Not the officers arriving. Not even the onlookers. But it mattered. It mattered more than anyone could know yet. Officer Tate tried to play it off, barking orders to clear the area, asking his fellow cops to control the crowd, but there was no saving face anymore. Not with cameras pointed from every angle. Not with Aaliyah now holding up her phone herself, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened, how she'd been stopped for doing nothing but unlocking her own bike. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But her voice cracked just enough to make it real. And every word landed like a hammer. Chief Monroe arrived minutes later, stepping out of an unmarked SUV, sunglasses on, suit too sharp for a Tuesday morning. He moved like a man used to cleaning up messes, smiling for cameras, making statements that sounded powerful but meant nothing. He walked right up to Marcus, tried to put on the friendly facade. "Sir, I understand there's been some confusion. Let's get everyone calmed down here. Maybe we can talk this out." Marcus looked him dead in the eyes and said, "There's no confusion. Your officer assaulted my daughter. In front of witnesses. And you're too late to spin this." Monroe's smile faltered. "Let's not escalate this unnecessarily," he said carefully. "We'll handle this internally. File a complaint, and we'll." Marcus cut him off. "You think I'm asking you for anything?" Monroe blinked, surprised. "We're not done," Marcus added, then turned and walked away, guiding Aaliyah to the truck. Later that night, Marcus sat in his garage, lights dimmed, laptop open. He moved through encrypted files, old communication lines, contact protocols buried deep within retired military systems. He wasn't reckless. He didn't want a scene. What he wanted was truth. Exposure. Accountability. And he had the tools to make it happen. Quietly. Legally. Strategically. Aaliyah watched him from the doorway. "What are you going to do, Daddy?" she asked softly. He looked up, his expression softening for the first time all day. "What I should have done a long time ago." She nodded, then stepped closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to fix everything," she whispered. He wrapped his arm around her. No. But I have to fix this. Over the next few days, nothing seemed unusual on the surface. Monroe made a vague statement to the press about an incident being reviewed. Tate was placed on administrative leave, but no details were released. School officials remained silent. Parents whispered, unsure which side to land on. Some neighbors avoided Marcus altogether. Others left silent messages of support, a card, a baked pie, a nod from across the street. The neighborhood was holding its breath. But behind the curtain, things were moving. A contact from Marcus's past, now working within the Department of Justice, received an encrypted package. Inside, video evidence, witness statements, a file tracking Tate's previous misconduct, and something else. A direct link between Chief Monroe and a decades-long internal cover-up involving dozens of excessive force complaints, all funneled through falsified reports and destroyed body cam footage. Names. Dates. Proof. Marcus hadn't just decided to defend his daughter. He'd decided to burn the entire corrupt system from the inside out. And the first domino was already falling. Quietly. Efficiently. Unstoppably. But the most shocking part of it all, the thing no one could see coming, was that what happened to Aaliyah wasn't random. It was targeted. And what Marcus would soon uncover, just before the moment everything came crashing down, would change not just his family's life, but the entire city's. Because the real reason Tate had gone after his daughter, had been buried deep in Marcus's past. A past he thought he'd left behind. And the truth, when it finally came out, would tear everything open. The hallway outside the Internal Affairs hearing room was quiet, sterile, and thick with the kind of tension that couldn't be seen, only felt. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, the only sound as officers, attorneys, and department staff moved in and out of closed doors with tight expressions. Marcus stood still, hands in his pockets, his body calm, but his mind sharp. He didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a man who already knew how it ended. Aaliyah sat on the bench beside him, legs crossed, backpack on her lap. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but her eyes never left the door ahead. She was waiting for something. Or someone. Inside, Officer Bradley Tate sat across from a panel of Internal Affairs investigators and a legal advisor from the city attorney's office. His uniform was clean, pressed to perfection, but his face was pale. Not scared, not yet, but shaken. He had tried to bluff his way through the past week, insisting the entire incident was a misunderstanding, that he followed protocol, that the girl was non-compliant. But something had shifted. The department was quiet in a way he hadn't expected. Chief Monroe hadn't returned his last few calls. And today, instead of being reassured that it was all under control, he'd been told to appear for questioning under oath. No cameras. No press. Just truth, or what they thought they knew of it. One of the investigators, a tall woman with gray streaks in her hair and steel in her eyes, leaned forward and asked, "Officer Tate, can you explain why you ignored the minor's identification and digital rental confirmation before physically detaining her?" Tate cleared his throat and answered with the same rehearsed tone, "I had reasonable suspicion based on her behavior and the location. The situation required rapid response, and she refused verbal commands." Another investigator, a younger black man with tired eyes, scribbled a note before speaking. "We've reviewed 5 different body cam clips from nearby units. There was no sign of a threat. She didn't resist. She tried to explain. You escalated." "Why?" Tate stiffened. "Because I've seen this trick before. Kids using fake accounts, stolen logins. She fit the profile." The woman's voice dropped. "What profile is that, officer?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down. The silence said enough. Outside the room, the door opened slowly, and a man in a suit stepped out and motioned to Marcus. "They're ready for you." Aaliyah looked up at her father, eyes searching for something, maybe fear, maybe doubt. But all she found was resolve. Marcus placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'll be right back," he said quietly. She nodded, and he walked past the threshold into the room that had been waiting for him all along. Tate's eyes twitched when Marcus entered. He sat straighter, tried to appear unaffected, but his hand gripped the edge of the table a little too tight. The panel welcomed Marcus, asked him to state his name and background. He spoke clearly, but briefly. Name, former service, current occupation. When they asked him to describe what happened that morning, he didn't tell them what they'd already heard. He told them what they didn't know. He told them about a file. It was subtle at first. He mentioned discrepancies in Officer Tate's past reports, irregularities in complaint processing, and disciplinary records that had vanished from digital systems but remained in analog logs filed years ago. The panel stiffened, confused. Tate shifted in his seat. "He's lying," Tate said suddenly, too loud for the room. "This is a setup." Marcus turned his gaze directly to him. "No. This is exposure." From his jacket pocket, Marcus pulled a small USB drive and placed it on the table. "Everything is on here. Bodycam footage that was never filed. Audio recordings from Monroe's office. Officer transcripts. Memos. Internal emails. Data trails they thought were deleted." The room fell still. The gray-haired investigator looked at the drive but didn't touch it. "Where did you get all this?" Marcus answered without flinching. "You don't ask questions like that unless you're ready to hear answers you can't ignore." Tate stood abruptly, his voice cracking. "This is illegal. He's manipulating evidence. This man's not law enforcement, he has no authority here." Marcus slowly rose from his chair, matching Tate's height with quiet calm. His voice was lower now, but colder. "You're right. I'm not law enforcement. I'm what law enforcement calls when they've already failed." Tate looked around the room, desperate for support, but no one moved. One of the investigators tapped the drive, then picked it up and inserted it into a department laptop. Within seconds, the screen filled with time-stamped footage, emails between Monroe and the city prosecutor's office, and a folder labeled, Suppressed Incidents. Inside that folder, dozens of complaints. Most of them against Tate. All of them closed without consequence. Including one from 5 years ago, filed by the sister of a man named Kendrick Lewis. The room's energy snapped like a whip. Marcus waited. He knew this part would land hardest. The younger investigator leaned forward, brows furrowed. "Kendrick Lewis, wasn't that the Navy SEAL killed during a domestic response raid in Georgia?" Marcus nodded once. "He was my teammate. My brother." Tate's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Marcus stepped closer. "That raid? The one the department claimed was triggered by a federal warrant? That was fabricated. Monroe greenlit it based on a tip from one of his own officers, someone looking for a promotion, someone who needed to show results fast. That someone was you." Tate's face turned white. "You filed a false report," Marcus continued, his voice sharp but calm. "You targeted Kendrick, set him up as a violent suspect based on nothing but lies and race. And when the entry team moved in, you pulled the trigger. You claimed he lunged. The audio says he didn't. The coroner says the shot was from behind." The room was silent. The laptop continued to play footage. One clip showed Monroe laughing during a private phone call. "Brad's got a nose for this kind of thing. Long as we don't leave a trail, we're golden." Another email displayed on the screen read, "Suppress the Kendrick file. Folded under federal. Don't let it float." Dated 3 days after the raid. Tate took a step back. His confidence was gone now, replaced by something worse than fear, exposure. Marcus watched him, unblinking. "You murdered Kendrick," Marcus said finally. "And then you laid hands on my daughter like nothing ever happened." The woman investigator turned to the others. We need to call the U.S. Attorney's office. Right now. The panel began to move. Phones came out. Legal representatives scrambled. But Marcus remained still, eyes fixed on the man who had thought himself untouchable. Tate tried one last time, muttering, You set me up. You planned this. Marcus nodded, slowly. You're damn right I did. Then, as he walked out of the room and into the hallway where Aaliyah waited, she stood and looked at him with wide eyes. Is it over? She asked. He looked down the hall, where chaos now stirred inside the hearing room. Not yet, he answered softly. But it will be. Because what had started on a sidewalk with one hateful decision, was now unraveling years of lies. And Marcus Johnson had just flipped the first switch. The hallway was no longer quiet. Behind the closed doors, voices rose and fell in a flurry of legal urgency, phones rang, chairs scraped, and the cold, mechanical whir of printers kicked on as Marcus and Aaliyah walked away from the chaos they had just unleashed. Marcus's steps were slow and even, but Aaliyah's breath came in short bursts. She was trying to keep up with his pace, not just physically, but emotionally, trying to process the weight of what she had just witnessed. Her father hadn't just stood up to a corrupt cop, he had dismantled an entire legacy of abuse, piece by piece, in front of the very people who once protected it. And yet, there was no satisfaction in his face. No smugness. Only focus. Are they really going to arrest him? She asked, her voice small and unsure. Marcus didn't answer right away. He stopped in the lobby, his eyes scanning the glass entrance doors like he expected something else to happen, something inevitable. Finally, he said, they have no choice. The evidence is airtight. The only question now is how far this goes. Aaliyah frowned. Farther than Tate. Marcus gave her a look, and she understood. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It never had been. This was about Monroe, the department, the entire chain of silence that let things like this continue for years. This was about how they treated people like her, like Kendrick, like him. They stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The air was heavy, humid, like a storm was building in the distance. As they crossed the parking lot, a familiar voice called out behind them. Mr. Johnson. Marcus turned. It was Special Agent Natalie Cruz from the Department of Justice. She had been the one Marcus sent the encrypted files to. Mid-30s, Latina, sharp suit, sharper mind. She approached with a look of urgency and relief combined. We've reviewed everything you sent. We're moving on Monroe immediately. A grand jury has been prepped. We'll have arrest warrants in hand by morning. Marcus gave a single nod. Good. That's where it starts. Natalie looked at Aaliyah, her expression softening. You okay, sweetheart? Aaliyah nodded, though her eyes were glassy. Just tired, she said, almost whispering. Natalie reached into her coat pocket and handed Marcus a folded document. This is the official acknowledgement of the materials. You're covered. No one's coming after you for how you got it. Marcus unfolded the paper, scanned it, then tucked it into his inner pocket without a word. Natalie hesitated, then added, We're going to need you for testimony. Both of you. It's going to get ugly before it gets better. Marcus finally met her eyes. I've seen worse. As they drove home, the weight of the day pressed into every silence. Aaliyah stared out the window, watching the city go by, same stores, same sidewalks, same people. And yet everything felt different now. The fear that had once lived in her chest, quiet and constant, had been replaced by something else. Not anger. Not pride. Just clarity. She glanced at her father. He looked tired. Not physically, but something deeper. The kind of tired that came from holding things in for too long. She spoke without turning her head. Did you always know about Kendrick? Marcus didn't respond right away. The pause felt like an entire mile. Finally, he said, I had suspicions. But I didn't have proof. Not until I started digging after what happened to you. She turned toward him then. But why didn't you do anything before? When it first happened? His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Because I was trying to let go. I thought, maybe if I let the past stay buried, you could have a future without knowing what kind of world I came from. I didn't want you to grow up angry. Her voice was barely audible. But you were angry anyway. Marcus's voice dropped. I was. Still am. But I didn't want that to define you. She looked down at her hands. It kind of already has. Back at the house, Marcus opened his laptop again, more out of habit than necessity. Everything that needed to be sent had already been sent. But his fingers still hovered over the keyboard like they didn't know how to stop moving. Aaliyah sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, eyes on him. What happens if they try to cover this up again? She asked. Marcus looked at her, and this time, his voice carried something heavier, not fear, but preparation. They won't. Not now. This thing is too big. Too many eyes. If they try to suppress it, someone else will leak it. I made sure of that. She tilted her head. You mean, it's out there? Marcus nodded. A few trusted hands. If anything happens to me, it goes public. The silence between them hung like a curtain for a few long seconds. Then, suddenly, the front door banged open. Marcus was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively reaching for the spot on his belt where a sidearm used to rest. But it wasn't an attack. It was Natalie again, breathless, a phone in her hand. You need to see this, she said quickly, stepping inside without waiting for permission. She held up her phone, playing a video that had just gone live online. It showed Monroe storming out of his office building, reporters swarming him. One shouted, "Is it true you covered up the Kendrick Lewis raid?" Monroe's face was red, sweating, uncharacteristically shaken. No comment, he snapped. Another reporter yelled, "What about the files Officer Tate destroyed? Did you order that?" Monroe turned, pointing a finger. This is a political hit job. You all are being manipulated. Then the camera caught something unexpected, a man standing quietly near the back, wearing a suit, holding a briefcase. The DOJ insignia on his ID badge was clear. He handed a document to Monroe in full view of the cameras. You've been served, he said flatly. The crowd erupted. Marcus leaned back slightly, arms folded. Natalie turned to him. It's happening faster than we expected. The public pressure is working. We're going to need to move Monroe into custody before he does something reckless. Marcus nodded slowly. He's not going down without a fight. That night, Aaliyah stood on the back porch, staring up at the sky. She heard the door open behind her, felt her father's presence beside her before he spoke. You okay? He asked. She shrugged. I don't know. Everything's changing, but it still feels like it's not enough. He stayed quiet for a moment, then said, that feeling. It never really goes away. But you get stronger. And eventually, it starts to feel like power instead of weight. She looked up at him, eyes gleaming in the porch light. You think they'll listen now? He took a deep breath, looking out into the darkness. They're listening. Now we just have to make sure they remember. Across town, inside a secure federal holding facility, Monroe sat alone in an interrogation room. No cuffs, but no phone, no lawyer yet. Just silence. Until the door opened, and a man in a sharp gray suit stepped inside, briefcase in hand. He placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. Do you recognize this? He asked. Monroe opened it and stared at the contents, photos, emails, audio transcripts. All of it damning. All of it connected to him. The agent sat down, calm as stone. You're not walking away from this. You can take someone down with you if you want. Or you can rot alone. Monroe's voice was low. He played me. That bastard set me up. The agent shook his head. He didn't set you up. He held up a mirror. As the hours passed, and the dominoes fell, Marcus and Aaliyah sat in their living room, watching the coverage unfold. It wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about fame. It was about something deeper. A reckoning. A beginning. And yet, even with everything now out in the open, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Something still didn't sit right. A detail. A thread that hadn't been pulled all the way through. And as he reached for his laptop again, Aaliyah asked, "What are you looking for?" He stared at the screen, eyes narrowing. There's one more name missing from the files. Someone they were protecting even more than Monroe. And when he found that name, the real war would begin. The following days passed like a slow burn, not explosive but quietly relentless, the kind of unfolding that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. The headlines didn't just report a scandal, they revealed a structure that had been built on silence and shadows, now collapsing under the weight of truth. Monroe's arrest sparked protests across the city, but not the chaotic kind people feared. These were organized, strategic, led by young black voices who had been dismissed or ignored for years. There was pain, yes, but also purpose. And while Monroe waited in a federal holding cell for formal indictment, Officer Tate's situation took a darker turn. His lawyer tried to negotiate a deal, offering partial cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. But what Tate hadn't anticipated was just how thoroughly he'd been exposed. The files Marcus provided didn't just implicate him in Kendrick Lewis's death, they tied him to 3 other use of force incidents previously ruled as inconclusive. One of the victims was a minor. Another had ended in paralysis. Now, every thread he pulled to save himself only tangled the noose tighter. Marcus didn't celebrate. He couldn't. There was still a restlessness inside him, a sense that this was too clean, too easy. For something as twisted and deep-rooted as the system Monroe controlled, Marcus expected more resistance. He had operated in enough dark corners of the world to know that silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes, it was the calm before the retaliation. And when he reopened the data folder late one night, cross-checking archived internal memos and names that hadn't made the official report, he found the missing piece. There was a civilian liaison listed in multiple chain-of-command conversations between Monroe and city officials. A private contractor who had been granted access to department surveillance systems under the guise of public safety consulting. The name didn't appear in any press releases. It didn't show up in court records. But Marcus recognized it the moment he saw it: Wesley Arnett. A former military intelligence officer. Dishonorably discharged. And years ago, briefly embedded with Marcus's own SEAL team during a high-risk extraction op. He wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous, the kind of man who understood systems well enough to manipulate them without ever leaving fingerprints. Marcus stared at the screen, mind churning. This was it. This was why Monroe had lasted so long. Why some of the footage had vanished entirely, why certain victims never received follow-up contact, why internal audits always came back clean. Arnett had been erasing trails before they even formed. And now, with Monroe and Tate out of the way, he was the last firewall between the truth and the full collapse of the machine. But exposing him wouldn't be simple. Arnett didn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. He worked in the shadows, protected by contracts, lawyers, and a deep understanding of how to stay just far enough from the line that no one could prove intent. Bringing him down would require more than documents. It would require leverage. And Marcus knew exactly where to find it. He called Natalie Cruz just after midnight, his voice low but clear. She was quiet for a long time after he explained what he'd found. "I've heard the name," she admitted finally. "But he's buried so deep I didn't think we'd be able to touch him. If he's involved, he's the architect. That means we're not just dealing with local corruption. This could lead to national exposure. Marcus didn't hesitate. Then we dig him out. The next morning, Aaliyah noticed something had changed. Her father was still calm, still quiet, but his focus had sharpened. He started making more calls. Short, encrypted conversations. People with military ties. Journalists. Civil rights attorneys. He brought in a cybersecurity expert from his old unit to help him trace Arnett's data patterns. And slowly, they started to see the structure behind the curtain. Arnett had built a data funneling system that intercepted and rerouted evidence before it hit internal servers. Complaints, body cam footage, civilian statements, anything sensitive was flagged and redirected to a private server. From there, it was scrubbed or altered, often before the department even reviewed it. Arnett billed the city as a risk mitigation specialist, his invoices buried in operational budgets. It was brilliant in its simplicity. And deadly in its consequences. As Marcus compiled the evidence, a familiar weight settled on his shoulders. Not just the danger, he was used to that, but the question of whether the people he was trying to help were truly ready to face how deep the betrayal ran. Because this wasn't just about one girl being assaulted, or one man being shot. It was about a system that had been built to survive exposure, one that evolved to make the public complicit through comfort, distraction, and doubt. One evening, Aaliyah confronted him in the garage while he reviewed documents under the pale light of a single hanging bulb. "Why are you still doing this?" she asked, her voice full of something more complicated than frustration. "You already took down Monroe. Tate's going to prison. Isn't that enough?" Marcus looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not about enough. It's about root cause. You don't kill a weed by cutting the stem. You kill it by tearing out the roots." She stepped closer, voice rising. "But you're not just tearing out weeds, you're going to war again. I can see it in your face. You're going back to that place you said you left behind." His voice was softer now. "That place never left me." Aaliyah blinked hard, her eyes wet. "I don't want to lose you over this. I already lost you for years when you were out there, and now you're back, but it's like you're disappearing again, just in a different way." Marcus closed the laptop and stepped forward, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I'm doing this so you never have to live like I did. So no one else's daughter gets dragged into the dirt and treated like property. This isn't just my fight. It's our future." That night, Aaliyah sat alone in her room, staring at her phone, rewatching the video of Monroe being served. She had posted it herself, anonymously, and it had gone viral. But now the comments were turning. People were asking deeper questions. Who let Monroe get away with it for so long? How many others knew? Why weren't more people being held accountable? The storm Marcus had started wasn't just consuming the guilty, it was waking the indifferent. Meanwhile, Marcus met with Natalie and a select few DOJ agents in a secure location. He presented the full file on Arnett. The servers. The invoices. The modified complaint logs. Everything. The agents exchanged tense glances. One of them, an older man who had seen decades of political maneuvering, said, "This will reach places you don't want it to reach. Senators. Contractors. Maybe even federal agencies." Marcus didn't blink. "I'm not looking for peace. I'm looking for truth." They agreed to open a formal investigation but warned him, this part wouldn't be quick. Arnett had layers of protection, legal and otherwise. They needed airtight proof that his actions directly violated civil liberties. Until then, they could freeze his access but not arrest him. Later that week, Arnett showed his face. Not in a courtroom. Not in a back alley. On a morning talk show. The host introduced him as a security and policy consultant, and praised his efforts in modernizing law enforcement data systems. Arnett smiled, clean-cut in a tailored suit, and spoke of efficiency, public-private partnerships, and balancing safety with civil rights. Marcus watched the segment with Aaliyah in their living room, silent until the end. Then he said, "He's not just trying to survive. He's rewriting the story in real time." That was when Marcus knew the final step wasn't legal. It was narrative. To truly finish what they started, they had to take the story away from the institutions that twisted it. They had to make people feel the truth. Not just know it. And that meant doing something dangerous. Going public. Natalie warned him against it. "It could jeopardize the case," she said. "You'll be opening yourself to scrutiny. Retaliation." But Marcus was resolute. "Then we control the release. We choose when, how, and what. We show them everything, on our terms." And so began the preparation for the final strike, not a weapon, not a raid, but a story. A documentary. A leak. A speech. A testimony. Whatever form it took, it would be built not on vengeance, but on clarity. Because in a world built on false versions of reality, sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do, is tell the truth. And as Marcus stood on the edge of that decision, looking at the city that was finally awake, he knew the next move had to be the boldest. One final revelation. One last truth. The one that would make it impossible for anyone to look away ever again. The evening air was thick with the weight of everything that had not yet been said. In the living room, the soft flicker of a muted news broadcast lit up Marcus's face as he sat in the armchair that had become his command post over the past weeks. The TV ran clips of protesters outside City Hall, some holding up signs with Monroe's face crossed out, others chanting phrases Aaliyah had heard only in history books and news reels. Marcus watched without speaking, the fingers of one hand tapping a slow, steady rhythm on the armrest while the other hand held his phone, its screen dark, waiting for the call that would either launch everything into motion or bring the walls crashing down. Aaliyah sat nearby, her legs folded beneath her, arms wrapped around a pillow, her eyes watching him more than the screen. He hadn't eaten since morning. She hadn't either. Neither of them mentioned it. She finally broke the silence, her voice low but sharp. "If you go on record, they'll come for you. You know that, right?" He didn't respond right away. Just kept tapping. She pressed on. "Not just the people you exposed. The people behind them. You've been careful for so long. What if this ruins everything?" Marcus turned to her slowly, the light from the TV catching the quiet tension in his eyes. "Some things are worth being ruined for," he said. "If the cost of safety is silence, then maybe it's time the world got a little louder." Aaliyah stared at him, heart racing. "But you already showed them. You gave them the files, the proof. Monroe's gone. Tate's in custody. What else is there?" He stood, walking toward the window, pulling the curtain slightly to look outside. Arnett's still out there, reshaping the narrative, pretending to be the solution to a problem he engineered. And the media is eating it up because it's clean. Palatable. It lets people sleep at night thinking the system works. But it doesn't. It just recycles the same power into a different face. He turned to her, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "This isn't just about what happened to you. Or Kendrick. Or me. It's about every family that never got a chance to fight back. About every voice that got buried in red tape. If I go quiet now, then I'm just another part of the machine pretending it's fixed." Aaliyah stood too, closing the space between them. "So what? You tell your story and hope people believe it? What if they say you're bitter? Or dangerous? What if they try to discredit you like they always do with people who speak up?" Marcus's voice dropped lower, but it hit harder. "Then let them try. But they'll have to do it out in the open. Not from behind a badge. Not from behind a suit. They'll have to look me in the eye and tell me I don't matter." She looked away, the tears brimming in her eyes now too real to hide. "I just got you back. I don't want to lose you again. Marcus stepped forward and placed both hands on her shoulders. You won't. No matter what happens next, I'm not going anywhere. You're not fighting this alone. We do this together. A knock at the door broke the moment. Marcus opened it to find Natalie standing there, her face drawn with concern and urgency. She stepped inside without waiting, holding out her phone. They're moving, she said. DOJ just approved public release of your files. But there's a condition. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Which is? Natalie hesitated. They want you to go on record. All of it. Interview. Press conference. Whatever form you choose. But your face, your name, your story. If this is going to survive the spin Arnett's putting out, it has to come from you. Marcus nodded slowly. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for it, even while dreading it. There was a difference between fighting in the dark and stepping into the light. He had spent years mastering silence. But now, it would be his voice that carried the weight. Later that night, as the house dimmed and the world outside continued spinning on its axis, Aaliyah knocked gently on his bedroom door. He was sitting at his desk, writing. Not typing. Writing. With pen and paper, the way he used to in the barracks after long missions. She stepped inside and sat across from him. What are you writing? She asked. He didn't look up. My statement. The first draft. She leaned forward, watching the way his fingers moved across the page, deliberate and calm. Can I hear it? He paused, then handed her the paper. She read the opening lines aloud. My name is Marcus Johnson. I served this country in silence for years, believing that my actions could protect people I'd never meet. But when the danger came home, when it wrapped its hands around my daughter's throat, I realized the enemy wasn't just overseas. It was wearing a badge. Sitting behind desks. Writing policies that sound like safety but smell like fear. She stopped reading. Her throat tightened. She handed the paper back without a word. The next morning, the sun rose on a city already shifting. Posters of Monroe were being torn down. A new police chief had been named, temporarily. More journalists began reaching out, not for scandal, but for clarity. They wanted Marcus. They wanted the face behind the fury. And finally, Marcus agreed. A local community center hosted the first public statement. No flashing lights. No podium. Just a wooden stage and rows of folding chairs. Neighbors came. Activists came. Survivors came. People who had never spoken up before. Aaliyah sat front row. Natalie stood in the back, arms crossed, watching the room settle into a fragile silence. Marcus stepped onto the stage wearing a plain black button-down and jeans, no suit, no armor. Just a man, ready to speak. He told the truth. He told them about Kendrick. About Aaliyah. About Monroe. About the names behind the names. The lies behind the reports. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for chaos. He called for consequence. For reformation that didn't start with broken windows but with broken systems. For accountability that didn't stop at a badge but looked beyond it, into the institutions that allowed the rot to fester. When he finished, the room was silent. Not out of discomfort, but respect. Not because they were shocked, but because they recognized something they hadn't heard in a long time, courage. Not theatrical. Not performative. Just raw, steady, undeniable truth. After the event, as people approached to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their stories, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not pride. Something quieter. Peace. But it didn't last. 2 days later, Aaliyah returned from school with a note left in her locker. No signature. No fingerprints. Just 6 words scribbled in marker, your dad should have stayed quiet. She gave it to Marcus without speaking. He read it, crumpled it, and threw it away. But inside, something shifted again. He knew Arnett wouldn't go down quietly. And this message wasn't just intimidation. It was a signal. A warning that the people still loyal to the system weren't finished. Later that night, as he reviewed another copy of the data, checking for anything missed, he paused at a folder he hadn't opened in days. Labeled Legacy, it held files from Kendrick's final mission. Reports. Comms. Debriefs. Among them was an old audio log, one that never made it to official records. He clicked play. Kendrick's voice filled the room. If anything ever happens to me, if I don't come back from this op, don't let them bury the truth. Not just about this mission. About all of it. The stuff they don't want people to know. Because one day, someone's gonna ask why no one said anything. And I need someone to be able to say, we tried. The message ended. Marcus closed his eyes. Not in grief, but in resolution. Aaliyah knocked on the door. Is it over? She asked again, the same question she had asked before. He looked at her, the weight still there, but balanced now by something else. No, he said. It's just beginning. The rain had started sometime after midnight, soft at first, like a whisper against the roof, but by dawn it had become a steady rhythm that filled the silence in Marcus's house like a heartbeat. He sat alone in the kitchen, the soft glow of the under-cabinet lights casting long shadows across his face. A cup of untouched coffee sat between his hands, steam rising slowly and disappearing into the heavy air. He hadn't slept. Not out of fear, but calculation. Every second of rest now was a second lost in a battle that demanded everything from him, his time, his focus, his restraint. The note left in Aaliyah's locker hadn't broken him, but it had clarified something he'd been trying to ignore. The enemy wasn't done. Arnett was still pulling strings, just further back in the dark now, letting others move for him. But what Arnett hadn't anticipated, what he would never understand, was that Marcus had seen darkness far deeper than anything he could conjure. And when you've lived in the shadows long enough, you learn how to see in them. Aaliyah entered the kitchen slowly, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts, her hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes tired. She poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter without looking at him. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was worn in. Comfortable in a way only two people who had survived something together could understand. Finally, she broke it. I told my teacher what happened. About the note. Marcus looked up, surprised. She met his gaze and shrugged. I didn't want to hide it. And I didn't want you to be the only one carrying it. He nodded slowly. What did they say? Aaliyah hesitated. She said the school's investigating. But she also said I should be careful not to amplify unnecessary attention. Her voice hardened at the end. Like I'm the problem now. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the bitterness flashing briefly in his eyes. People who live comfortably in systems like these are always more afraid of disruption than injustice. That teacher doesn't want you to stop talking because you're wrong, she wants you to stop because you're making her see something she's tried to ignore. Aaliyah took a deep breath, setting the glass down with a quiet clink. I'm not scared of them. I'm scared of what it's turning you into. He turned fully toward her now. And what's that? She didn't answer immediately. She crossed the room, sat down across from him. You're disappearing again. Just like when I was a kid. You're here, but your eyes are somewhere else. I know you think you're doing this for me. But it feels like you're preparing for something worse than just a press conference. Worse than Arnett. Her voice cracked. Are you planning to leave again? Marcus stared at her, the question hanging in the air like smoke. He reached across the table and placed his hand gently over hers. No. Not this time. But I need you to understand something. There are people in this world who don't fight fair. Who don't care about truth, or justice, or rules. Arnett is one of them. And he's not just a corrupt bureaucrat. He's a strategist. A manipulator. The kind of man who's built entire careers out of staying untouchable. If I don't prepare for every outcome, I'm putting you in danger. She looked down, her voice small but steady. So what's the plan? He exhaled slowly. The DOJ can only move so fast. There's bureaucracy. Chains of command. But I'm not bound by that. I have the names of 3 private companies Arnett contracted with over the last 2 years. 2 of them were data security firms. One of them specializes in threat analysis. And that one? It's a shell. No real offices. Just a mailbox and a P.O. box tied to an offshore account. Aaliyah frowned. So you're going after him, outside the law? Marcus's silence was the answer. She leaned forward, voice sharp now. You said this was about justice. About doing things the right way. You stood in front of all those people and promised transparency. You promised you wouldn't become them. His eyes locked on hers. And I meant it. But justice has never been a straight road. Sometimes, the system can't hold the truth. And when that happens, someone has to walk outside of it to make sure the people still inside it are safe. Aaliyah stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. If you cross that line, you're not just risking yourself. You're risking everything you fought for. Everything we already lost. Marcus stood too, his voice rising. And if I don't, he wins. He fades into the next position, the next title, while people keep getting hurt. You think this ends with Monroe? With a few files and a news clip? Arnett is the architect of this entire system, and if we don't expose him now, he'll bury us. He'll bury you. She didn't flinch. Then let me help. Don't shut me out. The words hit him harder than any weapon ever could. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and when he opened them, he was quieter. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push you away. I've lived most of my life believing I was the only one who could fix things. But maybe that's not true anymore. That night, they sat side by side on the couch, laptop open between them, cross-referencing data, timestamps, corporate filings, and security access logs. It was Aaliyah who caught the anomaly. A timestamp on a server backup that didn't align with any known data pulls from the department. A log that pointed to a private cloud server stored outside domestic jurisdiction. Marcus's breath caught. If the DOJ couldn't access that server, it meant Arnett had stored something he didn't want anyone to see. Maybe insurance. Maybe leverage. Maybe the real blueprint of how he built his empire. Marcus contacted an old tech from his SEAL days, a woman named Juno who had since moved into white hat cybersecurity. She owed him a favor. Within hours, they had a trace. Not the contents, but the location. A data center in Quebec. Juno said, if you want access, you'll need someone on the ground. Someone who can walk in and ask the right questions, or the wrong ones. Marcus didn't hesitate. I'll go. Natalie was furious when he told her. You're crossing a line, Marcus. This isn't just risky. It's reckless. If something happens to you across the border, we can't protect you. You'll be on your own. Marcus replied calmly, that's always been the deal. She shook her head. You don't understand. Arnett's not just watching from the shadows. He's watching you. If you make this move, it becomes personal. He will retaliate. And he's not going to do it with lawsuits. Marcus stared at her, unblinking. Then let him come. She turned to Aaliyah. And what about her? Are you willing to leave her alone while you chase ghosts? Aaliyah stepped in front of her father. He's not chasing ghosts. He's chasing answers. And we'll be ready. In the days that followed, preparations accelerated. Marcus drafted backup plans. Scheduled remote interviews to keep media pressure high. Released carefully timed pieces of evidence through anonymous networks. He made sure the momentum didn't slow, even if his physical presence would be absent for a few days. Aaliyah stayed behind, closely guarded by Natalie's team, with secure communication lines open at all times. When Marcus arrived in Quebec, the weather was brutal, ice clinging to the edges of buildings, the wind biting through even the thickest jacket. But he moved with purpose, silent and deliberate. The data center was disguised as a corporate tech hub, nondescript and heavily secured. But Marcus didn't need to sneak in. He had leverage, documentation proving that one of the servers inside had been leased under falsified contracts, linked to criminal investigations in another country. Inside, it didn't take long. He was granted access under the threat of federal escalation. What he found on the server stunned even him. Not just files. Videos. Photos. Internal memos. But most shocking of all, blackmail material. Dozens of public officials. Judges. Journalists. All compromised. Arnett had built a fortress not by hiding, but by holding secrets he could weaponize at any moment. Marcus downloaded everything. Triple encrypted it. And sent a single message to Juno, Deadman's switch is live. If you don't hear from me in 24 hours, release everything. Then he disappeared. Not for long. But long enough to set something irreversible in motion. When he returned home, Aaliyah was waiting on the porch, eyes locked on the driveway the moment his truck turned the corner. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his torso before he could even kill the engine. "You're late," she whispered against his chest. He smiled into her hair. "Had to take the scenic route." She pulled back, eyes searching his. "Did you get it?" He nodded. "We have everything." Inside the house, Marcus sat back down in the chair where it had all started. The files were ready. The system was exposed. But this time, it wouldn't just be about the fall. It would be about the reckoning. And what came next would change everything. The sun rose quietly over the city on the morning the files were released. No headlines screamed, no sirens wailed. But in every newsroom, every political office, and every government building with a name on Arnett's encrypted list, silence gave way to panic. The documents had been published through a global whistleblower network, every byte verified and authenticated. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering: recordings, financial trails, surveillance footage, messages, contracts, even recorded confessions. More than just proof of corruption, it was a mirror held up to an entire system that had rotted quietly from the inside, disguised by policy, padded language, and the false security of unchecked power. There was no room for deniability. It wasn't just the fall of Arnett, it was a chain reaction. Judges were suspended, police chiefs resigned, elected officials found themselves indicted within days. The Department of Justice, under immense public pressure, launched a task force to restructure city oversight protocols. Arnett, the ghost who had operated from the shadows for nearly 2 decades, was arrested while attempting to board a private plane in Nova Scotia. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. For a man who had built an empire from surveillance and blackmail, silence was the last weapon he had left. And it didn't work anymore. The trial that followed became the most publicized corruption case in recent state history. Marcus testified. So did Natalie, Juno, several internal whistleblowers, and, by her own choice, Aaliyah. She stood in that courtroom with calm defiance, her voice unwavering as she recounted the day her life had nearly been stolen by a man protected by the very system that claimed to serve her. The jury's decision was swift. Arnett was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, unlawful surveillance, and aiding civil rights violations. He was sentenced to life without parole. But his conviction was more than a punishment, it was a turning point. The city, now under federal oversight, began implementing reforms that weren't just performative. Transparency platforms were established. Independent review boards were granted full access. Bodycam footage became public record within 48 hours of any police interaction. Most importantly, victims and families were no longer forced to prove their humanity before being believed. For Marcus, the outcome was more than personal. It was a reckoning long overdue. Yet, he didn't seek credit. When reporters asked him to run for office or accept honorary recognition, he declined. "I'm not a leader," he said in one televised interview, "I'm a father. And I did what fathers are supposed to do, protect their children when no one else will." But the truth was, Marcus had become something larger than a protector. He had become a symbol of what accountability could look like when it's grounded in principle, not politics. In the months that followed, he quietly partnered with a group of grassroots organizers to create a foundation focused on mentoring youth, supporting whistleblowers, and rebuilding trust in underserved communities. He called it Kendrick's Light. As for Aaliyah, she changed too, but not in the way fear changes someone. She didn't shrink. She rose. With her father by her side, she gave interviews that weren't just statements, they were blueprints for how to resist with dignity. She applied to a civil rights law program and received a full scholarship. She told the admissions board, "I don't want to study the law to use it like a weapon, I want to use it like a shield." She later published an essay that went viral, "The Day They Tried to Silence Me," in which she spoke not of trauma, but transformation. She wrote, "I used to think survival meant staying quiet. Now I know survival is teaching others how to speak." Natalie Cruz was promoted to head a newly formed civil justice division within the DOJ. It was her work, quiet, tireless, invisible in its early days, that had allowed Marcus's information to move freely and securely through the right hands. And in the final hours of the case, when the courtroom was cleared and the media lights turned off, she met Marcus in the hallway and said, "You changed more than a city. You changed us." He simply nodded, the weight of everything unspoken between them acknowledged in silence. Officer Bradley Tate, now stripped of rank and rights, remained behind bars. His name, once protected by shields and silence, now sat beside headlines that read like a requiem of everything wrong with unchecked power. His fall wasn't dramatic. It was empty. He'd become a cautionary tale, not for criminals, but for cowards who abuse authority. And Monroe, the man who had built his kingdom on control, manipulation, and media smiles, pled guilty in a desperate attempt to avoid trial. His sentence was lighter than many thought fair. But Marcus had told Aaliyah, justice isn't always perfect. Sometimes it just has to be undeniable. Monroe's public apology aired once, recorded from a correctional facility, his voice stripped of charm. "I failed the people I swore to protect," he said, but no one applauded. They didn't need to. They had already moved on, to real change. As for Marcus, he began to sleep again. Not long, and not always peacefully, but without the need to check doors and windows every hour. One morning, months after everything had settled, he stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee in one hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Kids played in driveways. Neighbors waved. Aaliyah stepped out behind him, now nearly taller than he remembered her ever being, her eyes tired from studying but alive in a way that made his chest tighten. "You think it's over?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, smiling. "I think it's ours now." And as the sun climbed higher, casting light across the porch and onto their joined silhouettes, the world didn't feel fixed, but it felt different. Better. Not because it had changed on its own, but because they had demanded it. Now, to everyone listening, this story wasn't just about Marcus, Aaliyah, Monroe, or Arnett. It was about something much deeper. Something we all live with, whether we speak it aloud or carry it in silence. It's about the power of standing when standing is hard. About confronting systems that were never built for your protection and still choosing to fight for those who come after you. It's about what happens when the quietest voice in the room becomes the one everyone hears. And how sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken world, is tell the truth. So now I want to ask you, what would you have done? If it were your daughter? Your name on the report? Your silence being sold as safety? Would you speak up? Would you risk everything for something bigger than revenge, something called justice? Tell us in the comments. Share your thoughts. Your feelings. Your truths. And if this story made you think, made you feel, or made you want to be part of the change, then please, subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. Because we're not just telling stories here. We're telling truths the world needs to hear.